Today on the podcast, I finished talking about a trilogy of books. The series is His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, and the third book is The Amber Spyglass. So if that's something you're interested in, hang around and listen to a novel review. Hello and welcome to the Literature Podcast, a novel review. My name is Seamus, your host, and together we will discuss, dissect, and explore the wonderful world of literature. And the wonderful world of literature is a vast and dense jungle. So let's start making our way through, one book at a time. Hello everybody. Welcome back to another episode of a novel review, a book podcast. My name is Seamus. I am the host, and if this is your first time joining, thank you so much for joining me. If you're a returning listener, thank you so much for tuning in once again. Today, I'm talking about the third book in the His Dark Materials trilogy, Philip Pullman's The Amber Spyglass. It was an interesting book. This entire series was very interesting, very different to what I was expecting and to what actually happened on the page. It was recommended from a listener, which I absolutely love, and I just got to say thank you so much to them for recommending it. If you do have a book or a series you want done, suggest them, comment them, email me, whatever is the best way to contact me, social media, YouTube, and email. And I will endeavor to get to them as best I can. I can't do every book, of course, because there's so many wonderful books in the world, and there's just, I can only read so fast. So I did these 3 books over 3 months, and they're an incredible amount of fun to do. I will speak about them in a second, but first, I always take a moment to reflect on any mantelpiece moments, something to highlight from the week past. And if you've been following this podcast for the last few weeks, you will know that I have not been here in the regular sort of seat. I've actually been back in my native country of Australia. I was there for a mate's wedding, and it was absolutely fantastic. This is getting a bit of a longer journey to get where I want to go to, but I was in Australia, and so then when I came back to London, I had a bit of book mail waiting for me, which is absolutely fantastic. For the benefit of the listener, for you guys, I have pre-opened it, so I'm not sort of fiddling around with a bunch of scissors on air. So let's get to it. It is from Radiant Press because they've got their sticker on the front, so I could tell, so I sort of already knew what the book was going to be, which is very cool. And I've been looking forward to this book because it's getting some great reviews, and I can't wait to sort of jump into it. It's The Dark King Swallows the World by Robert G. Penner. It looks like it's going to be an absolutely fantastic book. The back says it's an instant classic in the spirit of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien is my favorite author, and I've read some C.S. Lewis. I've read the Chronicles of Narnia, so that was absolutely fantastic. Oh, I've just noticed there's a postcard in here. Anatomical Venus, which is another book they released. Hello, Seamus. Thank you for requesting Rob Penner's book. We hope you enjoy it. Sincerely, the Radiant team. Love that. That's very nice. Yeah, I can't wait. I mean, I love the cover as well. Simple blues and blacks. It's a pretty cool cover. I absolutely can't wait to get into it. I believe it's a standalone fantasy story as well, which is always like a fun thing to sort of jump in and out of. And I can't wait to jump into this. Yeah, that's my mantelpiece moment. Getting book mail is just like one of the best things in the world. So it's going to be a very fantasy-oriented podcast today because we've got a mantelpiece moment that's fantasy. We're, of course, talking about the third and final book of the His Dark Materials trilogy, The Amber Spyglass. And then I'm going to announce the new trilogy of fantasy books that I'm going to be doing. So that's very cool. The Dark King Swallows the World. Check it out. Radiant Press do some good stuff as well, so check them out as well. Small independent press. They release some very good books, and this is going to be one of them, I can already tell. Housekeeping, as always, if you would like to like and subscribe, I would really appreciate it. Subscribe, click the duck in the corner if you're on YouTube, 5-star reviews if you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast from. I would really appreciate it. It helps other people find the show. But as always, just thank you so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. So let's get on with the show. Okay, let's get into the main body of the podcast today. The third book in the trilogy series, His Dark Materials, The Amber Spyglass. I was really kind of looking forward to this book because I quite enjoyed the first two. I thought they were building up quite nicely. The first two being Northern Lights, or the Golden Compass, as I found out they call it in America, which I actually think is a better name because the other two books relate to a piece, a thing within the book, the thing that features in the book, and I think the Golden Compass actually relates better than Northern Lights. Neither here nor there. And then The Subtle Knife, and then, of course, The Amber Spyglass. I quite enjoyed the first two. I thought they were building up quite nicely to the third book, and I thought it was going to be absolutely sort of fantastic and answer a lot of the questions that I had. That being said, it did not live up to my expectation. I'm going to get that sort of out of the way very early. It's actually kind of weird because I enjoyed reading the book, but I didn't like it. And that is, that makes no sense at all, but I kind of like enjoyed reading it from the perspective of just like turning my brain off and enjoying a story that is a bit nonsensical in a way and just sort of having a bit of fun with it from that point of view. But in terms of like a big, great classic story, I didn't quite enjoy it. And this has a big following as well, these books. A lot of people really enjoy them. In fact, I looked them up after because I sort of got to the end and felt a bit unsatisfied. And I was like, well, what happened? Did I just miss something? Am I the problem? And I went and looked them up online on Goodreads. That's a really great place to start. And a lot of people loved them and a lot of people hated them. So I kind of felt happy about that a lot of people did also dislike this book. I don't think I hated it. Like I said, I still had a great amount of fun sort of reading it. But it just didn't tickle my fancy the right way. And I'll speak about that in a bit. First, I should probably do a bit of an overview. Although it's kind of hard to do an overview because it's such a big, chaotic, expansive book. Basically, the two main characters are Lyra and Will. They're from different worlds. And basically, we're building towards this moment of this decision that's going to be taking place, this moment in the garden as it is, Adam and Eve sort of moment in the garden and how the world sort of unfolds from that point. We're building up to that moment, to that decision where you've got to sort of make a choice. And it's sort of alluded to that Lyra is going to have this big, really big decision that she's going to have to choose. And then on top of that, there's a religious war going on. We're going through different worlds. We, in this book, journey to the land of the dead. So, the more I'm trying to explain it, the more it just sounds complicated and convoluted and a bit confusing. So I'm going to stop trying to explain it because it's a really, really difficult sort of trilogy to sum up, and it's a really difficult book to sum up as well. So I think I'll leave it there for the very, very dodgy, poor explanation. Let's start with a dislike for this book, actually. Let's start with something that I really actually quite disliked about this book, and I guess the series as a whole, is in the first book, Lyra is this really independent, cheeky character. She tells a lot of lies, which is where I think we get the name Lyra. That's a bit on the nose, but she's just a cheeky young girl. And she's really independent as well. She's quite fierce. The first book is just phenomenal because she basically leads like a mini revolution to rescue these children that have been snatched away by the gobblers. And she's got a lot of independence about her and she works well with other people, but she's really fierce and strong. And in the second book, we lose a bit of that. And I thought it might have just been her trying to find her way within the story as she sort of discovers who she is and what's actually going on, because of course it would be incredibly weird to wake up in another world. And then I thought, it was going to sort of build from there. But then in the third book, she just kind of loses her way altogether. It seems like in this book, she can't do anything without having Will's permission or like Will's consideration on it, which I really disliked because she lost a lot of her agency in this book. And in fact, I think a lot of the women lost their agency, which I really didn't like. Miss Coulter, who is Lyra's mother, in the first book is just this wonderfully fierce villain. She's a really, really kind of scary villain, and we kind of love that. You hate villains, but you also love villains because a really good villain is really frightening. And she's this wonderful, wonderful villain. And then in this third book, she's kind of reduced to this, she decides that she really, really loves Lyra and wants to protect Lyra. And I don't have a problem with that general story arc itself. But I thought the way we got from being this absolutely fierce villain to suddenly like being this babbling fool that just wants to protect Lyra, I thought was just way too brief and didn't really fit in within the confines of the story. That's not me saying that it couldn't have been done, but I just thought the way it was done just kind of removed a lot of her agency as well as a female character. So I didn't really like how the females were written in this book and how they ended up being written. I thought the first book was absolutely fantastic for that because it set up these wonderful female characters, and then they just kind of like lost their way. And Lyra especially, she just like literally needed Will for everything in this book, which I didn't quite enjoy. So that was one thing that kind of turned me off a little bit. That being said though, I thought the story actually moved forward with this really interesting I guess storyline, I didn't actually really know where it was going or how it was going to build to the final moment. And that was sort of true for the entire series. I had no idea where this story was really going, which can be, I think, frustrating at times, but it is also quite exciting because you don't necessarily want to know where you're going every single time you're reading a book, but it was still good for that because you just didn't know where you were going, and I quite enjoyed that a lot. That being said, I think the ending did go somewhere where I completely expected it to go, and it was a bit disappointing for that. I'm actually not going to speak about the ending just yet. I should talk about the story a bit more before I get there. So the story itself actually felt quite dark in this one. I quite enjoyed that aspect of the story. It did feel like it went to I was about to say a different kind of dimension. We literally go to the land of the dead in this, which I thought was very cool. I'm very fascinated by that kind of idea, being in a fantasy world, and then of course entering the land of the dead, I think is a really cool aspect. I think having studied ancient history at university as well, there's obviously Greek and Roman myths are not largely centered around the land of the dead, but they do feature in the myths. So to actually go to the land of the dead, I thought was like a really fun way. I will say I thought they got there kind of easily. They've kind of got the subtle knife just cutting through worlds, and it just felt like they kind of stumbled across it. I was hoping for a bit more kind of, I guess, like clues how to get there and a bit more of an adventure to get there, but it seemed a bit easy to get there. But once we were there, I was like, it's kind of fun. There's like dead people everywhere. You're carrying your deaths around with you every time. So this is what I mean in that I quite enjoyed the story, like where we went in this story. I quite enjoyed the adventures we took in the story, but sometimes I felt the execution was a bit lackluster, I guess. And I guess that sort of relates to a question I brought up in the second episode, The Subtle Knife, which was, I don't know who this book was actually written for, this trilogy was actually written for. I didn't know if it was meant to purely be sort of youth fiction or young adult fiction, as opposed to being adult fiction. And I think judging by the ending of the book and sort of how it was carried out in this book, it is definitely a young adult fiction sort of series, a young adult fantasy series. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. And that's something, I think that's just something you have to be aware of if you're reading these for the first time and you're not of that age, because there are some things in this book where you're like, oh, that, like, it just seems a bit childish to me. But then if you realize and recognize that it is for young people, then of course you're a lot more forgiving. I think just because I didn't have that established quite early in the story, I was expecting probably something a bit more, which is not necessarily my fault, not necessarily Philip Pullman's fault, just something that I noticed and felt. Because, and I guess I can speak about the ending now because I'm kind of sort of tiptoeing around it a lot. It's building up to this wonderful decision that Lyra has to make, this great temptation that she has to make, which I was really fascinated about throughout the whole series. What is this moment going to be? What is the temptation going to be that tempts her from perhaps good to evil, as it did, in Eve and the biblical stories? And that's what it's building to, this kind of biblical moment in the garden. And when we finally got to that moment, it just felt incredibly lackluster. It just felt, for me, incredibly, I don't want to say simplistic, because sometimes simplistic is actually like a really rich and interesting way to do things, just with like the simplest form of things. But I think, and again, this could come back to my fault of being sort of an age where it's not youth fiction for me anymore. The temptation was her and Will inevitably fall in love, which I think everyone expected from the moment we met them. As soon as I met them, I was like, they're probably going to fall in love, like they're two 12-year-olds. But the moment was, they have to then make a decision whose world they live in, or can they live in their respective worlds. I guess the final moment is the subtle knife has to be destroyed to resolve all the issues in the book, and the doors between worlds shut up. And so Lyra and Will have to make this decision of, should one of us forsake the life we have and live in each other's worlds, or should we just live the rest of our lives apart in separate worlds and never see each other again? The reason I didn't quite enjoy it was because, for me, the entire series felt like it was building to, there's this temptation for Lyra. This is Lyra's temptation. This is something that's going to be about her. And then when we finally got to the moment, I was like, it's actually kind of about both of them. Will's also got to make a conscious decision not to live in Lyra's world. But then something else I didn't quite like was, it's known that if you forsake your life in your world to live in another person's world, you can only live there for a certain amount of time before you get sick and die prematurely. And it's estimated that to be around 10 years, which means that if you make this decision at 12, you're probably going to be dead by 22. And so having that already hanging over them, they already know that they've got a clock on their lives. And so it kind of actually removed a lot of the temptation, because it was kind of like, well, yeah, I'd like to live in your world, but obviously I'm going to be dead in 10 years. So it's not that big a decision. I thought it wasn't that great a temptation. It wasn't like we're going to live together happily forever for the entirety of our lives to 80, perhaps 90. Knowing that you've only got potentially 10 years and some of them you're going to be spent sick, I think removed a lot of the temptation from the actual tempting moment, which I didn't quite enjoy as much. And then, of course, this is where it comes back to youth fiction or young adult fiction, is they're 12 years old. And I think reading that as a teenager would be a lot more affecting than reading that as someone that is now 30 years old, because they've got to make this decision as teenagers to split up from their relationship. And obviously they've been through a lot together. And that's one of the really strong points of this series, is the development of the adolescent in this book, in this entire series, I should say, is, you know, how they grow up and how they interact with different things and interact with more adult themes as the story goes on. That was actually done really, really well in this book. But the sheer moment of, okay, now we've got to break up, it's just kind of like, I think reading it as a not 12 or early teens or even late teens, just reading it as a two 12-year-olds have to break up after being together for, I think in this book it was like 4 days. It's kind of like, yeah, not that big a deal for me. Which, yeah, I fully concede is you know, just something that you've got to go with, because, you know, I'm obviously a lot older than 12, and you're not, the chance of you remaining with your 12-year-old girlfriend is incredibly slim for the rest of your life. So I think that was just a moment I was just like, it just didn't feel like that great a temptation. But like I said, this book did I think where this book really excelled, and the series really excelled, was the development of the adolescent in this book. Even though I didn't like the fact that Lyra lost a lot of her agency, it's how these two people, these two children, come together and learn to sort of communicate in different ways, go through different worlds together, experience all these different things, and of course have to make different kinds of sacrifices along the way. You know, there's a part in this book where they have to make a decision to go to the land of the dead, and that actually costs a great toll upon the personal individual, and they have to make that decision. And I thought that was actually more a tempting moment than the actual tempting moment. I won't spoil what that moment was, but I thought it was, you know, I mean, like, it's an interesting series. It did a few interesting things. Everyone I spoke to about this book said they absolutely loved it, which I think is quite interesting. But they also said that they read it at a young teen or early teen or sort of mid-teen age, which I think is quite telling and showing to the target audience for this book. So, I mean, I'm definitely not upset that I read it, and I know he has written other books about Dust. The Book of Dust, I think it's called, and I think that's going to be another trilogy as well, perhaps. Don't quote me on that. And I'd absolutely be interested to read them again, because I quite enjoyed his writing style, Philip Pullman's writing style. And I think actually reading that might give me more, I guess, information to what this world is, because that was something I think I didn't quite enjoy about this series, is the world building felt a bit flimsy. And I think that's, you know, most people would agree on that. It does feel a bit flimsy. It feels like he sort of started writing this series and the first book is set off on this really great trajectory. And then it kind of just falls apart a bit, and there's sort of, you know, multiple worlds. And of course, that's always going to be difficult to keep track of when you've got multiple worlds, infinite worlds technically. But I think the world building was just sort of not executed in a really, really fine way that made this story, I guess, absolutely believable in that sense. You've obviously got to concede something when you're reading fantasy, and you've got to commit to a fantasy world. But I think when the world building is not done up to scratch, it does feel a bit clunky. So that was something I didn't like. But like I said, it was a fun series, and I think I probably would have enjoyed it a lot more when I was younger. That being said, I'm not disappointed I read it. I'm very happy to have read it. It is, you know, an incredibly well-known series. There was a film about it, and HBO did 3 seasons on it. So, you know, it is obviously very known and very well respected. What would I rate it? I mean, it's difficult, because I didn't enjoy the first book that much. And then the second book, it sort of built on that, and I quite enjoyed the second book because I thought we were building to something really fantastic in the third book. But now that hasn't come off, it's actually made me reflect on the first book and actually enjoy that book a lot more, because obviously now I understand the story more. But I think as a story, the first book was just miles ahead of the 2 next books. So as a series, I'd probably give it a 3 out of 5. The Amber Spyglass, the book as it's on its own, I'd probably give a 2.8, maybe even a 3. I think a 3. A 3 is all right. So a really fun series. You know, like I said, I enjoyed reading it, but in terms of like fantasy and world building, I didn't quite enjoy it. So, I mean, check it out if you want to. You don't have to, of course. But that is Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, The Amber Spyglass. Okay, so normally I would talk about the books that I am reading this week, but it's time to announce the next fantasy series that I'm doing. So this will be coming out January, February, and March. And I've gone for something a bit different. I have no idea what they're about, but apparently they're absolutely fantastic. People say they're really, really well written, and they're incredibly different kind of fantasy stories, and it's not kings and queens and wars and all this stuff. So it's an incredibly different kind of world building. It's Mervyn Peake's series, the Gormenghast trilogy. So that's Titus Grown, Gormenghast, and Titus Alone. And I gotta say, I'm looking forward to this. I'm looking forward to doing something a bit different. I, of course, did the Harry Potter series in this year, 2024. I did the Thomas Covenant, the first Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. I've now done His Dark Materials. So I think going into something perhaps a little bit different, a little bit perhaps more speculative might be enjoyable. They look like they look big, but they don't look too big, which is also kind of nice. The third book looks quite short. That being said, they could be incredibly dense. I have no idea what they're really about, but it just looks interesting, and a lot of people have a lot of good things to say about them. So I'm looking forward to it a lot, to be quite honest. I'm looking forward to a change of pace in fantasy, something a bit different, which is not to say that there's nothing wrong with wars and stuff like that in the fantasy world, but exploring something a bit different could be an incredible amount of fun. And apparently Mervyn Peake is just an absolutely fantastic writer, which of course helps a lot when it comes to fantasy. So they're the books I'm going to be doing. I'm of course going to be starting with Titus Grown. I'm probably going to start reading that today just because it looks interesting. And like I said, I'm just keen to see and explore something a little bit different to the norm. So if you're interested, they're the books I'm going to be doing. January, February, March 2025. God, that seems ridiculous. 2025, so close already. Yeah, that's the trilogy I'm going to be doing next. If you do know any trilogies you'd like me to do, it doesn't have to be a trilogy, to be fair. I did the Harry Potter series, and that was 7 books. But I generally try to do 1 a month just to keep me interested, because I do love fantasy. So they're the books I'm doing. Hang around. Make sure you tune into them. It's going to be absolutely fun. If you have listened this far, please consider hitting those 5 stars. I would really appreciate it. Also, feel free to head along to the website and support the pod in other ways. But as always, just thank you so much for tuning in. So today, to take us away, I'm going to read a quote from The Amber Spyglass, Philip Pullman. It was really, really wonderful. At the start of every chapter, he had quotes from famous writers throughout history. And this one is from Pindar. And it was always fun to sort of, I think it just set the tone for the chapter. And so this one is from Pindar. It's from chapter 37, The Dunes. And yeah, Pindar is the writer. And the quote is, "My soul, do not seek eternal life, but exhaust the realm of the possible."